Have you ever judged someone by the way they looked, only to be completely wrong? This story will show you why respect should never be based on appearances. The cafe buzzed with life that morning. Coffee machines hissed, chairs scraped against the floor, and conversations overlapped in a lively hum. People hurried in with polished shoes, neatly pressed suits, and expensive bags, everyone looking like they belonged in the city's fast-paced rhythm. And then, he walked in. A man in a faded jacket and worn-out shoes stepped quietly through the glass doors. His hair was slightly unkempt, his face tired but calm, carrying the kind of look that told a story no one in that cafe cared to hear. He didn't demand attention. He didn't stand tall with confidence like the others. Instead, he walked slowly, almost humbly, toward the counter. The manager noticed him instantly. His eyes narrowed, lips curling into a half-smirk. This wasn't the kind of customer he liked serving. Still, the man offered a gentle smile and spoke softly. "Just a coffee and a sandwich, please." The request was simple, ordinary. But the manager let out a sharp laugh that carried through the cafe. Heads turned. People paused mid-sip and mid-conversation. The room, once filled with chatter, now had a new subject to watch. The manager leaned on the counter, voice dripping with sarcasm. "A coffee and a sandwich? I'll pay twice as much if you really have funds." The words stung the air like a cruel joke. Some customers chuckled, shaking their heads. Others hid their smiles behind their cups. To them, this man looked like someone who barely scraped by, someone who didn't belong in their polished world. But the man did not flinch. His expression stayed calm, his posture steady. He reached into his pocket, not hurriedly, not nervously, but with quiet dignity. His hand pulled out a few crumpled bills, the kind that looked as though they had passed through countless hands before his. He placed them gently on the counter, pushing them forward without a word. The smirk on the manager's face grew wider. His tone was cutting, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We don't serve unless we're sure. People like you come in here all the time, trying to take advantage." The cafe's energy shifted. The laughter faded into an uncomfortable silence. Some customers looked away, guilt stirring in their hearts. Others leaned in, curious to see what would happen next. Through it all, the man stood tall, not in wealth, not in status, but in patience. His silence spoke louder than any defense he could give. The test of dignity had just begun. The crumpled bills rested on the counter, but instead of taking them, the manager crossed his arms and leaned forward with a sneer. His voice, sharp and mocking, carried across the cafe. "We don't serve people unless we're sure. People like you show up, pretending, wasting our time." A few customers chuckled nervously. Others turned their eyes back to their phones, trying to pretend they hadn't heard. But no one spoke up. No one defended the man. The stranger, however, didn't break. He stood there quietly, shoulders relaxed, his face calm. His silence seemed to unsettle the room more than anger would have. There was no pleading, no sharp reply, only a steady gaze, as though he was used to being judged by appearances. The manager, emboldened by the quiet, raised his voice even louder. "Do you even know how much this costs? A sandwich here isn't cheap. This isn't the kind of place for, well, people like you." Those words lingered, heavy and cruel. A young woman sitting by the window shifted uncomfortably. An older man lowered his cup of coffee, frowning. Whispers spread across the room, but still, no one intervened. The stranger gently slid the bills closer across the counter. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear but from restraint, choosing dignity over confrontation. He lifted his eyes to the manager, not with anger, but with a faint smile that carried both patience and pain. "I only asked for coffee and a sandwich," he said softly, his voice steady, almost serene. That simple reply silenced even the whispers. For a moment, the cafe seemed to pause. The hiss of the coffee machine faded into the background, the clatter of dishes dulled. Every person inside could feel the sting of injustice, even if they weren't the ones on the receiving end. But the manager wasn't finished. He scoffed, shaking his head. "Save your money. You'll need it more somewhere else." The humiliation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The stranger, however, did not reach for his bills. He did not storm out. He simply stood there, quiet, patient, unshaken. And in that moment, something powerful unfolded. While the manager believed he was exposing the man's weakness, he was only revealing his own. The cafe had become a silent stage, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The cafe sat in uneasy silence, all eyes darting between the smirking manager and the quiet stranger who stood at the counter with unshaken dignity. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that feels louder than words. And then, the door swung open. A young employee hurried in, slightly out of breath, still tugging off his coat. His eyes instantly caught the man at the counter, and then widened in recognition. The color drained from his face. He rushed toward the manager, whispering frantically in his ear. The words weren't loud, but the manager's reaction was impossible to hide. His smirk disappeared. His posture stiffened. His eyes flickered nervously toward the stranger, then back at the young employee. The cafe, sensing something had shifted, leaned in, watching closely. The whispers grew louder. "What did he say?" someone muttered at a table near the door. "Who is that man?" asked another, craning her neck to see. The manager shook his head, as if refusing to believe what he'd just heard. But the young employee nodded urgently, repeating himself. The truth hit the manager like a blow. The man he had mocked, insulted, and humiliated wasn't just a random customer. He was the newly appointed CEO of the city's largest bank, a man whose signature could change lives, whose influence reached far beyond the walls of that little cafe. The manager's face turned pale. The arrogance drained from his body as quickly as it had filled it minutes earlier. He stammered, fumbling for words, his lips parting but no sound coming out. The stranger, meanwhile, hadn't moved. He still stood quietly, calm and patient, as though he had expected this very moment. His eyes met the manager's trembling gaze, but he said nothing. The cafe was electric with realization. The same customers who had laughed now sat frozen, wide-eyed, their expressions shifting from amusement to shame. The ones who had looked away now couldn't stop staring. The truth spread like wildfire. This wasn't a poor man at all. He was a leader. A visionary. A man with more wealth than anyone in that cafe could imagine. And yet, he had walked in humbly, with nothing but a simple request for coffee and a sandwich. The revelation was undeniable, and the weight of it pressed down on everyone in the room. The stage was set. What would the CEO do next? The cafe felt like it was holding its breath. The manager stood frozen, his arrogance replaced with a nervous sweat that glistened at his temples. Customers leaned in, hungry to see how the stranger, the man now revealed as a bank CEO, would respond. Everyone expected anger. A scolding. Maybe even revenge. After all, who wouldn't use their power in that moment? Who wouldn't demand respect after such humiliation? But the stranger simply lifted his gaze, his eyes calm, steady, almost kind. He reached down, picked up the crumpled bills from the counter, and folded them neatly in his hand. Then, in a voice both gentle and firm, he spoke, his words carrying across the room like a quiet thunder. True wealth isn't measured by money, it's measured by how we treat one another. The cafe fell into silence. No one stirred. Even the hiss of the coffee machine seemed to pause. The stranger turned slightly, addressing not just the manager but everyone watching. You see, kindness costs nothing, but its value is priceless. Yet, here I was, treated as though I had none of it, simply because of the way I looked. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, shame flickering across faces. The young employee who had revealed the truth lowered his head, his eyes brimming with respect for the man now speaking. The stranger then reached into his wallet, not to flaunt wealth, but to make a point. He pulled out a generous tip and handed it directly to the young cashier, whose hands shook as he accepted it. "For your honesty," the CEO said softly. "Integrity deserves reward." Finally, his eyes returned to the trembling manager. But instead of condemnation, his words carried a lesson. Double your kindness before you ever think of doubling a price. The message was sharp, yet merciful. He wasn't there to humiliate the manager, but to awaken him, to remind everyone that titles, clothes, and appearances mean nothing compared to the way we treat another human being. For a long moment, no one moved. The cafe was wrapped in stillness, the weight of his words pressing deeply into every heart. And then, slowly, the stranger stepped back, leaving behind not anger, but a lesson that none of them would ever forget. For a moment after the CEO's words, the cafe remained utterly still. It was as if time itself had stopped. Every person inside was frozen, replaying what they had just witnessed. The manager, once smug and towering with arrogance, now looked small. His head lowered, his hands fidgeting at his sides. He had no clever words left, no smirk to hide behind. The lesson cut deeper than any scolding could. At one of the corner tables, a mother pulled her little boy closer, whispering softly so he would remember. "Respect everyone, no matter what they look like." An elderly man near the window nodded slowly, as if the stranger's words had stirred something long forgotten in his own heart. Even those who had laughed earlier now sat heavy with shame, wishing they had spoken up when cruelty first filled the air. The young cashier clutched the generous tip the CEO had given him, tears glistening in his eyes. For him, it wasn't about the money, it was about the recognition, the validation that honesty and integrity still mattered in a world that too often overlooked them. The CEO, however, carried no bitterness. He didn't lecture further. He didn't need to. With quiet grace, he turned toward the door. His steps were unhurried, his posture calm, almost serene. He had walked in seeking nothing more than coffee and a sandwich, but he left behind something far greater, a mirror that revealed the soul of everyone in that cafe. As the door swung open, sunlight spilled into the room, illuminating his silhouette. He paused only once, glancing back with a gentle smile. And though he spoke no more words, his presence whispered a truth that would linger. Sparkle's respect costs nothing, but it can make the world infinitely richer. Sparkles. The door closed behind him, and the cafe exhaled at last. Conversations slowly resumed, but they weren't the same. The laughter had softened, the tones gentler. People carried themselves differently, as though touched by a silent vow to never repeat what they had just seen. That morning, a lesson far more nourishing than coffee or sandwiches was served: true wealth is found not in money, but in kindness. And everyone who witnessed it walked away a little richer.